Hi, this will be Ecology Part 2. So just as a reminder, we've talked about this before, but what defines a species? A species is a group of organisms which have similar characteristics and can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. This is something we've hit on before, should be familiar. These are great. These are called dragon's blood trees. Cool. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same geographic area. All right, so here in this picture you see a population of monarch butterflies. A community is a group of organisms, these are different species, that live in the same geographic area or ecosystem. Okay, so in this picture you see a piece of a coral reef and it has a community of several different species. I'm going to ask you a question there. How many different species can you see in this picture? Kind of take a pause and take a count and see, and then answer it on the question in the next slide. All right, what is an ecosystem then? Well, an ecosystem is a distinct geographic area where organisms of different species interact with each other and with the non-living components of their environment. Okay, so basically it's the community plus all the non-living stuff. So an ecosystem will include the air, the soil, the water, anything that's not living. Okay, the sun, amount of sunlight. All right, that's what the ecosystem includes. Communities will only include the living species that exist in that area, and populations are how many of a particular species might exist in that area. Okay, and that also leads us at the very top here to another term, which hopefully some of you will recognize, called the biosphere. But firstly, let's take a look at abiotic versus biotic parts of an ecosystem. Okay, biotic factors are anything living within an ecosystem. So in this particular picture, you would see things like trees, grass, giraffe, crane, people. Okay, is that a kangaroo? Something. Okay, so there's living things in here. Those are all biotic factors. Abiotic factors are anything that is not living within the ecosystem. So this would include water, air, land, space, amount of sunlight. Those are all abiotic factors. Those are just two good terms to kind of get your head around. They're not too hard. Bio means life, okay? So if it's biotic, it's living. If it's abiotic, abio means without life. Both are important to the health of an ecosystem, however. You can't have life without having access to abiotic factors. So if you have abiotic factors that are supporting a population, and you have a small population that has an abundant amount of resources, these sorts of populations will actually show unlimited growth. And in fact, this unlimited growth is known as exponential growth. And when you look at a graph of exponential growth, you see something like this, which is a little scary, I know, but this is human population since sort of, 2,000 years, the past 2,000 years. All right, so right now, if you look at this, the first billion people existed on the planet in 1804. The second billion came in 1927, 123 years later, then 3 billion people 33 years later, then 4 billion 14 years later. You see what's happening? 5 billion 13 years later, 6 billion 12 years later. All right, so unless we sort of reduce our growth rate fairly soon, we are on track, actually, because we're already well over 7 billion. And we're at 2020. I think we're at 7.4 or 7.3 billion right now. So we're still growing fairly rapidly, and that's problematic because there are limiting factors. Once resources begin to deplete, growth will slow. Okay, resources that can affect the growth of a population are called limiting factors. So can you think of some examples of limiting factors for any population? These might have included, some of you may have said, food, water, light, oxygen, living space, number of predators, amount of competition, specific minerals that may be of nutritional necessity. Lots of things can impact how well a population will grow. And ultimately, a population will reach what's called a carrying capacity. When a population begins to reach the maximum number of individuals that can be maintained in a certain environment due to living needs, it is called a carrying capacity. Carrying capacity will be different for different species because they have different needs, okay? It will be different for different environments because there will be differences in the resources that are available. So if you look at what a graph of exponential growth and then carrying capacity sort of looks like, you can see that you have this initial exponential growth when it seems as though resources are just available all over the place. And then eventually you reach a point where some of those limiting factors will start limiting the population growth. And usually what happens in that case is the population will overshoot a little bit, it will die off a little bit, and then it will increase again, and it starts doing this wobbling right around what we would consider to be the carrying capacity. And eventually it will sort of level off a little bit, and the carrying capacity will sort of decrease a little bit also because those resources are continuing to be used up. But basically this is what graphs look like for populations as they reach carrying capacity. And you will have noticed in the last slide when we were showing the human population, the last graph we showed, that we're still sort of right here on human population. We haven't quite reached our carrying, I mean, some would argue that we have reached our carrying capacity. We're just using technology to kind of make it last a little bit longer. But we're sort of in a critical time period of us trying to figure out how to stabilize our growth and sustain our populations where we are. Back to what is the biosphere. So the biosphere is the part of the earth where life exists. So if you look at our planet, it's actually a very narrow kind of layer on the outside of the earth where life exists. It's this tiny, tiny little bubble, basically, of life. All right, within life, living things do compete with each other. So when two or more individuals in a population try to use the same resource, it is called competition. It can happen within the same population or between different populations. What you see in this picture is a population of barnacles, so a single population. And what resource would you say is being fought over in this particular example? There are also predator-prey relationships within populations and communities. Many organisms feed on one another. So the organism that does the eating is the predator, and the organism that's being eaten is the prey, of course. But because these two groups of organisms live with each other over millennia, thousands of years, there are lots of adaptations that each of them make in order to be more successful. Predator adaptations include things like speed for this cheetah here. They also include camouflage like this scorpionfish, or maybe venom to help them be more successful as a predator, or maybe trapping mechanisms like spider webs. So there's lots of different adaptations that predators can have to help them be better hunters. The flip side of this is that prey will also adapt to their situation. Prey might also rely on speed to get away. Some prey might rely on grouping behavior, so that if they're all together, only a few will get taken. It'll be harder to take all of them. Or having really good hiding places like prairie dogs, or maybe toxins or poisons that would make them, maybe not so attractive to eat, or even mimicry and camouflage like you see in this butterfly down here. I just found out about this actually it's not a butterfly, it's a moth. This moth is crazy. It has these markings on it that make it look like it's a couple of flies trying to eat bird droppings. And so something flying, like a bird flying over, would think, oh, just a couple of insects, I'm not looking for those, and some bird droppings. So they pass it by. It's a crazy adaptation. Other things that happen over long periods of time as organisms live together are symbioses. All right. This, as we've talked about before, is a close long-term association between two or more species where one organism lives on, in, or closely associated with the other. There are three basic types of symbiotes. We talked about this already before. There's mutualism, where both benefit, commensalism, where one benefits and the other doesn't care, and parasitism, where one benefits and the other is harmed. Okay, just a reminder of those. I know we've already talked about those in the past. And something else I want to mention is that relationships can change over time, and interactions and relationships change organisms. When a long-term change takes place between species because of their relationship together, it is called co-evolution. Okay, so there's some really good examples of this that we can find in nature. One of those is some very specific acacia ants and the acacia tree. And I'm going to I'm going to give you these links separately here in a minute. And I want you to take a look at these two videos. It kind of illustrates this co-evolutionary relationship between these two organisms. It's kind of cool. Coevolution also exists in between flowers and pollinators. It's an age-old example of specific flowers adapting to the specific pollinator that pollinates them. In the case of these two here on the left, this moth is the only organism with a proboscis long enough to reach down into the nectar at the very bottom of this flower. It's actually a kind of orchid. And as a result, this moth is pretty much the sole pollinator of this flower. But they have co-evolved together to serve those purposes. The moth gets the nectar, the flower gets pollinated, and both survive. So that's a good example of coevolution. This one over here is another orchid. And as you look at it, you might notice that these are the flowers. The flowers actually look like an insect. And the insect that it looks like, as it flies by, thinks that there's a potential mate down there. So they come down to investigate, meanwhile, picking up pollen. And then they'll fly to the next flower going, wait a minute, that wasn't what I thought it was, but I'm going to go look at this other one. Maybe this is a potential mate. And they land on another flower. Meanwhile, they've transferred the pollen, and the flower gets pollinated and is happy. Poor insect is not so satisfied because it still hasn't found a mate, but the deception works, and the flower survives and reproduces. Lastly, I'll give you a second to try and figure out what you're staring at here. Mimicry and camouflage can work for predators as well. which we already mentioned, but this is sort of a co-evolutionary predator mimicry situation, camouflage, where this particular praying mantis has developed over time to mimic the colors that are on this flower. So is the flower receive any benefit from this? Possibly. If there are insects that would come in and potentially eat or damage or infest the plant, the praying mantis actually eats them and protects the plant from them. The only problem is that it could potentially protect the flower from being pollinated. But I suspect that whatever pollinates this particular flower might be something that the praying mantis might not go after. Or the praying mantis itself is actually doing the pollination because it's moving back and forth between flowers to feed. Anyway, interesting things to kind of contemplate. All right, I think we're at the end of what I wanted to cover today, and so I'm going to go ahead and stop.